In 1963, a man in central Turkey knocked down a wall in his basement and found a tunnel. The tunnel led to another tunnel, and that tunnel led to something that should not have existed. Not a cellar, not a storage room, not a forgotten corner of someone else's house. What lay behind that wall was, as researchers would spend years confirming, an underground city, a vast, carefully constructed, self-sustaining underground city, carved entirely from volcanic rock, descending through what researchers describe as up to 18 separate levels, deep enough that anyone moving through its lowest passages would find themselves further below the surface than the height of a 20-story building. The man's name is not recorded anywhere. He was not an archaeologist. He was not searching for anything remarkable. He knocked down a wall because he wanted more space. What he found instead was one of the most extraordinary things the ancient world ever left behind. The city's name, we now know, is Derinkuyu, and the story of how it was built, who built it, why it was built, and what it says about the people who carved their survival into solid stone across many centuries, is one of the strangest and most deeply human stories you will ever hear. Settle in. Let your breathing slow. You do not need to hold on tightly. You do not need to remember any of this tonight. If you drift somewhere in the middle, that is perfectly fine. The stone has been waiting for centuries. Perhaps longer. It can wait a little longer.
Chapter 1. The Man Who Knocked Down a Wall. Begin with what is real. Not with the full weight of what was eventually discovered. Not with the scale of what lay waiting in the dark. With the single ordinary moment that started everything. A man. A basement. A wall that should have been solid and was not. Derinkuyu is a small town in the Nevşehir province of central Turkey, sitting inside a region called Cappadocia. If you have seen photographs of Cappadocia, you may remember the landscape. Tall columns of pale rock rising from the earth like something a dreaming giant left behind. Valleys carved into shapes that seem to belong to imagination rather than geology. The whole terrain looking less like a place where people live and more like a place where stories are set. In 1963, Derinkuyu looked much as it had for generations. A quiet town. Stone houses. Narrow streets. Basements dug into the soft volcanic rock beneath, which was common in the region because the rock was easy to work and the temperature underground stayed cool through the long hot summers. The man who knocked down that wall was doing what people in Derinkuyu had done for centuries. Expanding his living space. Working with the stone the way his neighbors worked with it. The way his father had. The way people in this part of Turkey had always done without thinking much about it. The wall came down. Behind it was a tunnel. This alone was not completely surprising. Small underground passages and chambers had been found before in the region. People knew the ground here had been worked. What surprised him was what the tunnel led to. Because the tunnel did not end, it connected to another passage. And that passage connected to a chamber. And the chamber opened into a corridor. And the corridor descended. And kept descending. Archaeologists and researchers from the Turkish government arrived in the months that followed. What they found took years to fully understand, and in some ways is still being understood today. The site they were mapping was not a basement. It was not a cellar. It was not even a large underground complex of the kind known from other parts of the ancient world. Researchers came to describe it as having up to 18 levels carved into the volcanic rock beneath the town, reaching a depth of approximately 85 meters below the surface. To give that some scale, 85 meters is roughly the height of a 25-story building. Except instead of rising into the sky, every floor of this structure descended into the earth. The space contained rooms that appeared to have functioned as living quarters, storage areas, stables for animals, kitchens, spaces for producing wine and oil, wells, ventilation shafts, and what appear to be gathering areas for communities of people. Researchers found evidence of a church carved directly into the rock, with the proportions and orientation of a Byzantine Christian sacred space. They found what appeared to be areas for communal instruction, passages wide enough for two people to walk side by side, and passages so narrow that a person would need to turn sideways to move through them. The site was opened to the public in 1969. Since then, it has been studied and visited by researchers and travelers from around the world. Archaeological estimates, based on the volume of the carved space, the infrastructure for food and water, and the capacity of the living areas, suggest that Derinkuyu could have sheltered what researchers estimate was approximately 20,000 people, along with their livestock and enough stored provisions to sustain that population for an extended period underground. 20,000 people. Sit with that number for a moment. That is not a small community taking shelter in a cave. 20,000 people is a city. A city with the organization, the planning, and the infrastructure that a city requires. A city that was entirely invisible from the surface. There is something quietly remarkable about how this discovery happened. The great archaeological sites of the ancient world, the pyramids of Egypt, the ruins of Rome, the temples of Greece. These things were never entirely forgotten. They stood above the ground. They demanded attention. They were impossible to ignore, even when no one fully understood what they were. Derinkuyu was different. For centuries, the people of this town lived above one of the largest underground cities ever built, using its uppermost levels as cool storage for food and wine, never fully understanding what lay beneath their feet. The complete scale of what existed below had faded so thoroughly from living memory that when the wall came down in 1963, it was a genuine surprise. A city that could shelter 20,000 people had become, over time, a basement. That is not a story about a distant and different world. That is a story about how completely something can slip from the memory of the people living directly above it. The Turkish government recognized the significance of what had been found. Mapping and excavation efforts expanded through the 1960s. Researchers began working to understand not just the physical dimensions of the site, but the questions those dimensions raised. Who built this? When? Why? And what kind of world made it necessary? Those questions do not have simple answers. The honest answer, the one the archaeological record actually supports, is layered in a way that makes Derinkuyu more interesting, not less. Because the city beneath the town was not built by one people in one moment of history. It was built, and used, and expanded, and returned to, across a span of time that may stretch across many centuries. The man who knocked down the wall in 1963 did not know any of this. He just wanted more space. What he got instead was a door into one of the longest and strangest stories the ground beneath our feet has ever kept. Chapter 2. What Cappadocia is made of. On a clear morning in Cappadocia, before the heat arrives, the light does something unusual. It comes up slowly over the eastern ridge and moves across a landscape that seems to belong to a different planet. Tall columns of pale rock casting long shadows across valley floors. Cliffs shaped by wind and water into forms that no architectural tradition ever deliberately chose. The whole terrain carrying a quality of stillness that feels older than the towns built among it. And beneath all of it, beneath the columns and the carved cliff faces and the quiet streets of towns like Derinkuyu, the same geological history that produced the landscape above also produced something entirely invisible from the surface. A world underground. Millions of years ago, two volcanoes dominated the landscape of central Anatolia. Their names today are Erciyes and Hasan Dağı, and, though both are now dormant, they were once among the most active geological forces in the region. Over an immense span of time, These volcanoes produced eruptions that covered the surrounding land in layer after layer of ash, pumice, and debris. That material settled, compressed, and hardened into a type of rock that geologists call volcanic tuff. Volcanic tuff is unusual. When you first cut into it, it behaves almost like compacted earth, soft enough to work with basic tools, with bronze implements, with iron, even with harder stones used as simple cutting instruments. A person with modest tools and patience can carve through volcanic tuff in ways that would be considerably more difficult with harder rock. But here is what changes everything. Once volcanic tuff is cut and exposed to air, it hardens. The same material that was soft enough to carve becomes, over time, durable enough to last. You could build a room in volcanic tuff with tools that an ancient craftsman would have recognized, and that room would still be standing centuries later. Think about what that combination means for someone who needed to build quickly, quietly, and permanently. You could carve with simple tools. You did not need the resources of an empire or the technology of a later age. A community with enough hands and enough time could do the work themselves. And when the work was done, the material would hold. Not for a generation, for centuries. The landscape above ground tells the same story from a different angle. The fairy chimneys, the carved valleys, the cliffs shaped into impossible forms. These are all expressions of the same volcanic history that made underground construction not just possible here but practical. People had been carving into this rock long before anyone built something on the scale of Derinkuyu. Small chambers, storage rooms, simple shelters cut into cliff faces. These appear across Cappadocia in contexts that stretch back well into prehistory. The habit of going inward and downward, of using the earth itself as building material and as shelter, was not an invention at Derinkuyu. It was a continuation. What changed, at some point, across multiple periods of time, was the scale. Turkish authorities have confirmed the existence of more than 200 underground sites of varying sizes across the Cappadocia region. Derinkuyu is the largest that has been fully opened and mapped, approximately 9 kilometers away. There is another underground city called Cappadocia. Geophysical surveys between the two sites have produced evidence that researchers describe as consistent with a connecting tunnel, though that tunnel has not been excavated and its full extent is not confirmed. More than 200 sites. And Derinkuyu is only the one whose full scale we know. Here is the thing about volcanic tuff that the numbers alone cannot convey. Every person who ever picked up a tool and began carving in this landscape was making the same discovery that the person before them had made. The rock gives. It yields to patient hands. And when you stop, when you set down your tool and run your fingers along the surface, you have cut. The rock is already beginning to harden around the shape you gave it. It is as though the ground here was waiting to be shaped. As though it had always been waiting. The geology created the possibility. History created the necessity. And the history of what drove people into this particular piece of rock, again and again, across many centuries, is where the story becomes something more than the story of a place. It becomes the story of what human beings do when the world above can no longer be trusted. Chapter 3. Who built it? The answer is layered. Here is the most honest thing that can be said about who built Derinkuyu. We do not know with certainty. Not the name of the first community that decided to carve beyond simple storage. Not the decade or the century when the deeper levels were first cut. Not the specific people who understood that what they were building would need to shelter thousands, and built accordingly. What the archaeological record gives us instead is something more interesting, and in some ways more true to how the ancient world actually worked. It gives us layers. Picture the stone itself, not the finished passages and carved rooms, but the raw face of the rock before any tool touched it. Every person who ever stood at that face and began to cut was continuing something that someone else had started. Adding a room to a passage that already existed. Extending a corridor that earlier hands had begun. Going a little deeper into the dark that previous generations had opened. Derinkuyu is not a monument to one civilization's achievement. It is a record of a continuing human response to a continuing human problem. The problem of survival in a landscape that was, for much of its documented history, a place where safety could not be assumed. Each generation that used this space found something left by the people before them. Each generation added something for the people who would come after. No single era built this. No single mind designed it. What exists today is the accumulated result of many separate decisions, made across many separate centuries, by people who shared a landscape and a vulnerability, but not necessarily a language, a religion, or a name for what they were building. The oldest written reference that researchers connect to underground habitation in Cappadocia comes from a Greek soldier and writer named Xenophon. Around 400 BCE, Xenophon led a large group of Greek mercenaries through Anatolia after a failed military campaign in Persia, an experience he documented in a work known as the Anabasis. In that account, Xenophon describes passing through villages in the region where people kept their homes partly underground, descending into the earth during the cold months and living there with their animals. He does not name Derinkuyu. He does not describe anything approaching the scale of what archaeologists eventually found. But his account is the earliest written evidence that underground habitation in this region was already an established practice by the 4th century BCE. Established enough that a Greek traveler passing through found it unremarkable enough to mention briefly and move on. By the 4th century BCE, this was simply how people lived here. The question of who first carved the deeper levels is one that researchers have approached carefully and honestly. Some scholars have proposed that the earliest significant excavation may date to the Hittite period, the civilization that dominated much of Anatolia from roughly 1800 to 1200 BCE. Others have suggested the Phrygians, who moved into the region after the disruptions that ended the Hittite world, as possible early builders. These attributions remain proposals rather than confirmed conclusions. The physical evidence for specific early phases is suggestive in places but not definitive. Any researcher working seriously on this site will tell you the same thing. The dating of the deepest levels is still an open question. What is not an open question is the Byzantine layer. The evidence for significant use and expansion of Derinkuyu during the Byzantine period, roughly the 4th through the 14th centuries CE, is the clearest and most extensively documented phase in the site's history. Byzantine Christians left marks on the walls that are not ambiguous. Crosses carved into the stone at multiple locations. A church carved directly into the rock, with the architectural features of a Byzantine Christian sacred space. What appears to be a space used for communal instruction. A room whose dimensions suggest it was designed for a group rather than an individual. Byzantine historical sources also provide context for why these spaces were being used and expanded during this period. Context we will follow more closely in a later chapter. For now, what matters is the shape of the answer. The honest picture of who built Derinkuyu looks something like this. The rock was first worked, perhaps for simple shelter or storage, in a period that researchers cautiously place somewhere in the centuries before the Common Era, though the precise dating remains uncertain. At some point, possibly during the upheavals of the Late Bronze Age or the Phrygian period that followed, the underground spaces were expanded into something more deliberate and more defensive. During the Byzantine period, the site was used extensively, expanded further, and given the religious character that is most visible to researchers today, and across all of these phases, the people returning to the space were not starting over. They were continuing something, adding to something. There is a detail in that pattern worth pausing on. The people who used Derinkuyu during the Byzantine period did not build the deepest levels. Those levels were already there, carved by hands that had been gone for centuries. The Byzantine communities who sealed themselves inside this rock during times of danger were trusting infrastructure built by people they had no direct knowledge of. People whose names and language and specific fears were no longer part of any living memory. They trusted it anyway. They went down into levels they had not built, sealed doors that earlier hands had carved, and survived. That act of trust, the decision to stake your life on the judgment of people you will never know, is one of the quieter and more remarkable things that Derinkuyu demonstrates. And it was repeated by different communities across many centuries, each one going down into the dark that someone else had prepared, each one coming back up. Chapter 4. The Engineering of Survival. There is a particular kind of intelligence that does not show up in written records. It does not appear in philosophy or poetry or the names of kings. It does not leave behind monuments designed to announce its own existence. It shows up instead in the details of how a problem was solved, in the specific decisions made by people who understood exactly what they needed to survive and built accordingly. The people who carved and expanded Derinkuyu had that kind of intelligence, and the evidence for it is not in any single dramatic feature of the site. It is in the accumulation of small, precise, deliberate decisions that together produced a space capable of sustaining thousands of human beings underground for extended periods of time. Begin with the problem of air. A sealed underground space is not habitable for long without ventilation. Carbon dioxide accumulates. Oxygen depletes. Fires for cooking and warmth consume what breathable air remains. A community of thousands of people living underground without a solution to this problem would not survive days, let alone the weeks or months that the scale of Derinkuyu's infrastructure suggests its builders anticipated. The ventilation system at Derinkuyu is one of the most studied features of the site. A central shaft descends through the rock, connecting upper levels to lower ones, moving air through the complex by means of natural convection. Dozens of secondary shafts branch from this system, reaching into rooms and corridors throughout the site. The shafts are positioned and angled in ways that suggest their designers understood how air moves through enclosed spaces, how temperature differentials create airflow, how to use the natural properties of the rock and the geometry of the tunnels to keep the air in the lower levels breathable without any mechanical assistance whatsoever. No machinery, no external power, just stone and geometry, and a precise understanding of how air behaves underground. Take a breath and consider what that means. A system designed and carved by hand, using tools that left no written manual behind, that moved breathable air through rock to a depth of approximately 85 meters, and kept doing so across centuries of intermittent use. Now consider the problem of water. A community of thousands needs water every day. The obvious solution, drawing water from above ground, was also the most dangerous one. An enemy force above would understand immediately that controlling access to water meant controlling the people below. Based on what researchers have observed about their positioning, the internal wells at Derinkuyu appear to have been arranged to reduce the risk of contamination or disruption from the surface, keeping control of that resource in the hands of the people inside rather than those outside. The storage infrastructure tells a similar story. Spaces throughout the complex were used for storing grain, wine, and oil. Carved stone vessels still visible in areas that functioned as wineries, where grapes could be processed underground. Spaces that appear to have functioned as oil presses. Livestock areas carved into the rock with dimensions appropriate for cattle and smaller animals, allowing a community to maintain its food supply without depending on anything from outside. What this adds up to is not simply a hiding place. It is a closed system, a self-sustaining environment capable of supporting human life for an extended period with no input from the world above. every essential function: breathing, drinking, eating, cooking, worshipping, keeping animals, producing food, was accounted for and given dedicated space within the rock. Set that thought down for a moment. The communication infrastructure is one of the details that tends to stay with people who study this site carefully. Throughout the complex, there are small holes cut through walls at heights corresponding to a person standing or crouching in the corridor. These holes are too small for a person to pass through. Ledistry, they are precisely the right size for a voice to carry through. For a message to be passed without the sender needing to move through the tunnels at all. In a space housing thousands of people across multiple levels. The ability to communicate without physical movement was not a convenience. It was a necessity. Someone thought of it. Someone carved it into the design. And then there are the doors. The rolling stone doors of Derinkuyu deserve their own chapter. And they have one, but they belong here too. In the context of the engineering, because they are the element that completes the system. Everything else, the ventilation, the water, the food storage, the communication, all of it was designed to sustain life inside the complex. The doors were designed to guarantee that the life inside could not be ended from outside. The doors are circular, carved from the same volcanic tuff as the walls and floors around them. Some of the larger ones are estimated to weigh several hundred kilograms. They are designed to roll across a doorway, sealing a passage completely. And they have one feature that defines everything about what they were for. They can only be opened from the inside. The engineering of this place is the biography of a community that had thought very carefully about what survival required and had built each answer into the rock before they needed it. They were not improvising in a moment of crisis. They were preparing in moments of relative safety for the crises they knew were coming. Because the crises had come before, and the people who had survived them had passed that knowledge forward. Every ventilation shaft, every carefully positioned well, every storage chamber, every small hole in a wall for voices to pass through, is a record of that knowledge. Not written down, not carved in words, carved in function. Chapter 5. The doors that only open from inside. Imagine the moment of closing. Not the construction of the door, not the engineering decision that produced it. The specific human moment when a community, carrying what they could, moving children and animals through narrow passages by torchlight, reached the last corridor before the surface and rolled the stone across the entrance. The sound it made as it settled into place, the sudden completeness of the silence that followed, the knowledge, shared by everyone present at that moment, that the world above was now on the other side of something that could not be opened from outside. The rolling stone doors of Derinkuyu are discussed most often as engineering achievements. And they are that. The precision required to carve a circular stone that fits its channel closely enough to seal a passage while still being movable by the people inside required skill and planning that should not be underestimated. The larger doors, estimated at several hundred kilograms each, had to be balanced well enough that a small group could move them when needed, heavy enough that no force from outside could push them open, and durable enough to function across decades or centuries of intermittent use. All of that is real and remarkable. But the detail that matters most about these doors is not mechanical. It is the decision the mechanism represents. Someone decided, at some point in the long history of this place, that the doors would only open from inside. That was not an accident of design. It was a choice, a specific, deliberate choice made by people who understood what they were building and what they were building it against. A door that only opens from inside tells you something very precise about the mind that designed it. It tells you that the designer had accepted a particular truth about the situation the door was built for. When the door is closed, the people inside are not trying to get out. They are trying to stay in. And the door's only job is to make sure that nothing outside can change that. There is a hole at roughly the center of each door. At the height where a standing person could reach it comfortably. The hole is large enough for a long implement to be pushed through from the inside, bracing against the tunnel wall on the far side and preventing the door from being moved, even if someone outside understood the mechanism. It is also large enough for a spear to be thrust outward at anyone attempting to force entry. The door is a shield. The hole in the door is a weapon. Together, they describe a community that was not passively hiding. They were actively defending, from a position they had chosen and prepared, against threats they had anticipated in enough detail to build countermeasures into the stone. Now hold the human reality of what closing that door meant. Researchers do not have direct records of how long individual periods of underground habitation lasted at Derinkuyu. There are no journals, no diarias, no accounts from inside the complex during any specific period of use. The scale of the infrastructure suggests the space was designed for extended occupation rather than brief shelter. The food storage, the wine production, the oil presses, the livestock areas, the ventilation system capable of sustaining thousands of people. None of this makes sense as preparation for a few days underground. The scale of what was built implies weeks, possibly months, in near-complete darkness, beyond whatever torches and oil lamps could provide, with the sounds of thousands of people in a confined space, breathing, moving, speaking in low voices, animals shifting in their carved stalls, with the knowledge carried by every adult present that the door at the top of the passage was sealed, and that what was happening above was something they had judged too dangerous to face on the surface. The psychological weight of that is not something the stone can fully convey. But the stone does convey something. It conveys the fact that the people in this space survived. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly. Across what researchers believe were multiple distinct phases of use, separated by calmer periods when the upper levels served as storage and the deeper ones sat empty and waiting. The doors were opened again. Every time. Eventually, the doors were opened again. Whatever had been above passed, or retreated, or moved on somewhere else. And the community that had sealed itself inside emerged back into the light, carrying with them the knowledge of what the space below could do. The knowledge they would pass to their children, who would pass it to theirs. There is something worth noting about what the doors did not do. They did not make the people inside invisible to the world above. Anyone who knew about Derinkuyu knew it was there. The ventilation shafts opened at the surface. The entrances, though sealed, existed at known locations. The city underground was not a secret in the way that a hidden room is a secret. It was a defense. And the nature of that defense was specific. It said, to anyone who knew what lay beneath the ground, something very clear. You know we are here. You cannot reach us. We will outlast you. That is a particular kind of courage. Not the courage of open confrontation. The courage of endurance. The courage of people who had looked at the threats in their world clearly enough to build a response that worked across centuries, and who trusted that response enough to seal themselves inside it and wait. The door only opens from inside. That was not a limitation. That was the point. Chapter 6. Who were they hiding from? Picture a single family on a clear afternoon somewhere in Cappadocia, perhaps in the 7th century CE. They are farmers. They have a house above ground. Animals. A small plot of land that produces enough to live on. Their children have never known anything other than this landscape. These stone walls. This particular quality of light in the late afternoon. And then someone arrives with news. The news travels faster than the threat itself always does. A rider from the next valley. Or a shepherd who saw something from a high ridge. or simply the particular silence that settles over a region when the people who know something are moving quickly. The message is the same message that communities in this landscape had been receiving, in one form or another, for centuries before this family was born. Something is coming. Go below. To understand why that message was so consistent across so many centuries in this particular place, you have to understand where Cappadocia sits, not just on a map, but in the larger geography of human movement and conflict across several thousand years of history. The interior of the Anatolian plateau was not remote in the way that word implies distance from importance. It sat at the intersection of movements that shaped the ancient and medieval world for more than 3,000 years. Any power expanding westward from Persia moved through Anatolia. Any force pushing eastward from the Mediterranean moved through Anatolia in the other direction. Any army moving between the Black Sea coast and the warm ports of the Levant passed through or near this plateau. Cappadocia was not on the edge of the ancient world's conflicts. It was close to the center of them. The earliest possible phases of underground construction at Derinkuyu fall in a period when the eastern Mediterranean world was experiencing one of the most dramatic disruptions in recorded history. Around 1200 BCE, the great palace civilizations of the Bronze Age collapsed within a span of roughly 50 years. The Hittite Empire, whose heartland was in Anatolia not far from Cappadocia, was among the civilizations that did not survive. Its capital was burned. Its administrative system vanished. The people who had lived within its boundaries found themselves in a world where the structures that had organized their safety were suddenly gone. In that context, the impulse to go underground carries a particular weight, not as a permanent solution, as a response to a world where the surface had become unpredictable in ways that no single generation could have fully anticipated. But it is the Byzantine period that gives us the most specific and verifiable answer to the question of who the people of Derinkuyu were hiding from. In the 7th century CE, Arab armies began expanding out of the Arabian Peninsula with remarkable speed. Within a generation, they had taken Syria, Egypt, and Persia. By the mid-7th century, they were launching regular raids deep into Anatolia. Byzantine chronicles from this period record communities in Cappadocia retreating underground during periods of danger. These accounts are not detailed enough to confirm specific uses of Derinkuyu by name, but they establish clearly that underground habitation in the region was a documented and practiced response to the raids of this period. Come back to that family on the clear afternoon. The news has arrived. The children are being gathered. The animals are being moved toward the entrance that everyone in the community knows. The entrance that looks from the outside like nothing more than a low stone doorway in the side of a hill. Neighbors are appearing from their houses with the particular efficient movement of people who have done this before, or whose parents told them exactly what to do when the time came. They go below. They bring the church with them, in the sense that matters. The community that gathers in the carved nave below the surface is the same community that gathers above. The prayers are the same prayers. The faces are the same faces. Only the sky is missing. And the sky, for now, is exactly the part of the world they do not need. The infrastructure that Derinkuyu represents fits precisely with what a community would need to survive extended periods without access to the surface. Sealed doors, internal water, stored food, ventilation that keeps the air breathable for weeks or months. Everything that the family on the clear afternoon would need to wait out whatever was coming, and emerge afterward to find their house still standing and their land still there. The Mongol campaigns of the 13th century brought another wave of disruption through Anatolia, following a decisive battle in 1243 CE. Mongol forces established control over much of the region, and communities across Anatolia faced the same calculations that earlier inhabitants of Derinkuyu had faced for centuries. The underground infrastructure, by then ancient and well understood by the people living above it, offered the same answers it had always offered. And then, in the 20th century, there is this. Before the full scale of Derinkuyu was understood, before the researchers arrived in 1963, the people of the town were still using the uppermost levels of the complex, storing food, keeping animals cool in the summer heat, going about the daily life of a town built above something immense that they no longer fully understood. The habit of going underground had never entirely left. Only the memory of why it had once been so completely necessary had faded. 3,000 years of pressure. Bronze Age collapse. Arab raids. Mongol campaigns. The slow attrition of medieval violence. The specific threats changed with each century. The geography that made Cappadocia a place those threats kept finding did not change. That family on the clear afternoon, gathering their children and their animals and moving toward the low stone doorway, was not exceptional. They were one moment in a pattern that stretched back further than their grandparents could remember and forward further than they could imagine. Derinkuyu was not built against one enemy. It was built against the recurring human reality that in this particular place, the surface of the world could not always be trusted. And the people who understood that built their answer so thoroughly that it outlasted every threat they ever faced. Chapter 7. The City Beneath the City. Derinkuyu did not exist alone. Let that settle for a moment before the details arrive. Because the instinct, when you first encounter a place like Derinkuyu, is to treat it as singular, an anomalu, the product of a specific combination of geology and history and human ingenuity that came together once, in one place, and produced something with no parallel. That instinct is wrong, and understanding why changes the entire scale of what Cappadocia represents. 9 kilometers from Derinkuyu, there is a town called Kaymakli. Beneath it, there is another underground city. Kaymakli shares the fundamental characteristics of Derinkuyu: rolling stone doors, internal water supply, ventilation shafts, spaces for livestock, food storage, and community gathering. The same volcanic tough construction, the same quality of patient carving, the same evidence of a community that had thought carefully about what extended underground habitation would require. Today, 4 of Kaymakli's levels are open to researchers and visitors. Scholars believe additional levels exist that have not been fully excavated or opened. The full extent of what lies beneath Kaymakli is not yet known. Between Derinkuyu and Kaymakli, geophysical surveys have produced evidence that researchers describe as consistent with the existence of a connecting tunnel, a passage running through the rock between the two cities, roughly 9 kilometers in length, that would have allowed movement between the two underground complexes without surfacing. That tunnel has not been excavated. Its condition, its full extent, whether it remains passable at any point, none of this is confirmed. The geophysical evidence is suggestive. It is not conclusive. But hold the possibility for a moment, because it matters. 2 underground cities, each capable of sheltering thousands of people, potentially connected by a passage that allowed movement between them without exposure to whatever was happening above. Communities in both locations could coordinate during a crisis. Supplies could be moved. People could be redistributed between the two spaces depending on conditions. The combined capacity of the two cities, if they functioned as a connected system, would represent a scale of underground infrastructure that is genuinely difficult to parallel anywhere in the ancient world. That is not a confirmed fact. It is the direction the evidence is pointing. Now, let that thought rest, because the evidence does not stop at Kaymakli. And there is one other site worth spending a moment with, because it reveals something about the range of thinking that went into these underground places. North of the main Cappadocian cluster, there is a site called Ozkanak. Ezkanak has its own distinctive features, and one of them is unlike anything found at Derinkuyu or Kaymakli. Its ventilation passages include openings that researchers believe were designed to allow defenders to pour boiling water or other materials onto attackers attempting to force entry through the tunnels below. Think about what that specific feature represents. Someone at Özkanok had thought through exactly what it would look like if an enemy force found the entrance and tried to push inside. They had imagined the angle of approach, the width of the passage, the position a defender would need to be in to respond effectively, and they had built that response into the stone before the moment of crisis arrived. The same intelligence that produced Derinkuyu's ventilation system and sealed wells applied to a different, specific problem, arriving at a different, specific solution. Each underground city in Cappadocia is a record of a community's particular thinking about survival. Turkish authorities have confirmed the existence of more than 200 such sites across the region, most of them smaller than Derinkuyu, most of them not fully mapped, some of them barely entered, more than 200. And Derinkuyu is only the one whose full scale we know. The technology available to researchers today, ground-penetrating radar, geophysical survey methods, remote sensing, is revealing features of this underground world that excavation alone could never have found. Every year, the picture grows slightly larger and slightly more complex. Every expansion of that picture raises the same question in a slightly more insistent form. How much of what was built here do we still not know about? The answer, based on everything researchers have found so far, is almost certainly quite a lot. Beneath the landscape of a region roughly the size of a small American state, more than 200 carved spaces sit in the dark. Most of them have not been fully mapped. Some of them have barely been entered. And somewhere between Derinkuyu and Kaymakli, 9 kilometers of rock may or may not contain a passage that two communities carved toward each other across generations, moving through the stone in opposite directions, building toward a connection that neither community would live to complete alone. We have been studying this region for more than 60 years since the wall came down in 1963. The ground is still keeping its secrets. Chapter 8. The people who lived there. At some point in the study of any ancient place, the archaeology stops being about stones and starts being about people. The ventilation shafts and the rolling doors and the carved storage chambers are impressive. The scale of the engineering is genuinely remarkable. But behind every shaft that was dug, and every door that was carved, and every room that was given a specific purpose, there were human beings making decisions, carrying out work, living with the consequences of what they built. We do not know their names. Not a single name of a person who lived in Derinkuyu during any of its periods of use has come down to us. There are no written accounts from inside the complex. No journals. No letters. No inscriptions that say who a specific person was or what they experienced in the dark below. The people who sealed themselves inside this rock and survived whatever was happening above them are, as individuals, completely invisible to history. What they left behind is everything else. And everything else, when you look at it carefully, tells a story that names alone could never fully carry. Consider the church, carved directly into the rock on one of the middle levels of the complex. The church at Derinkuyu has the proportions and orientation of a Byzantine Christian sacred space. It has a nave. It has an apse. It has the architectural grammar of a space built for communal worship, translated faithfully from the stone churches that Byzantine Christians built above ground into the volcanic tuff below. Someone made the decision that when the community went underground, the church came with them. That single decision tells you something about what the community understood itself to be. Not just a group of people surviving together in a difficult time. A community with a shared identity, a shared practice, a shared sense of who they were that did not stop at the entrance to the tunnel. The church was not a convenience. It was a statement. We are the same people below as we are above. What defines us here too. There are spaces in the complex that researchers describe as consistent with areas used for communal instruction. Rooms whose dimensions and layout suggest they were designed for groups rather than individuals. For teaching and gathering, and the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next, the work of maintaining a community's identity, its stories and practices and skills, did not stop when the doors were sealed. Life continued. In a different form, in a darker and more confined space. But it continued. Now think about the children. We cannot know exactly what their experience was. The physical evidence gives us only indirect clues. Researchers have noted that certain passages in the complex are narrower than others, sized in ways that would have required an adult to move through them carefully. Whether this reflects deliberate design choices, the practical result of carving minimum necessary passages, or simply the variation that comes from work done across many periods by many hands, is genuinely uncertain. What can be said without reaching beyond the evidence is that the complex was used by communities that included children, and that children would have experienced this space in ways quite different from the adults around them. A child who spent weeks or months here during a period of surface danger would have known things that no amount of description can fully convey. The particular texture of volcanic tuff under hands in near-complete darkness. The sound of the ventilation shafts when wind moved through them from above. A low and intermittent tone that would have been one of the few sounds connecting the world below to the world above. The smell of the livestock areas and the oil lamps and the carved church, all of it compressed together in a space where the ordinary separations of life above ground had been replaced by proximity. They would also have understood the way children understand the emotional reality of the adults around them, even when they are not told things directly. That whatever was above was serious enough that the adults had sealed the doors. The holes in the walls carry a particular weight in this context. Throughout the complex, small openings cut through walls at heights, corresponding to a person standing or crouching in the corridor, allowed voices to pass between rooms without physical movement. In the circumstances of underground confinement, those openings were more than communication infrastructure. A parent in one room and a child in another could hear each other through a hole in the wall. A sick person confined to one area and the family members who needed to continue the work of the community could stay in contact. An elder whose movement was limited and the younger people carrying the daily tasks could maintain the thread of conversation that held a community together. The holes in the walls were engineering. They were also, in the circumstances of that particular darkness, a form of care. Research on communities that lived in similar conditions during the conflicts of the 20th century. Civilians who sheltered in underground spaces during prolonged periods of danger documented consistent patterns of human response. Communities that maintained normal routines, that continued to hold religious services, observe shared meal times, and sustain the social roles and practices that defined them in ordinary life, fared significantly better than those that allowed the structure of daily life to dissolve under pressure. The church at Derinkuyu, the spaces for communal gathering, the organized food preparation infrastructure that would have imposed routines on the community's daily life. These were not incidental features of the underground city. They were, whether their builders understood them in these precise terms or not, the mechanisms by which a community maintained its identity and its cohesion through what must have been genuinely difficult periods of time. And then there is the simplest detail of all. They kept coming back. The archaeological evidence suggests multiple phases of use across many centuries. Each time the surface became dangerous, the community went below. Each time the danger passed, they came back up. And when they came back up, they did not abandon what they had built. They maintained it. They passed the knowledge of it to the next generation. The decision to preserve Derinkuyu across centuries was not made by any single person or any single generation. It was made repeatedly, by community after community, each one inheriting a space that earlier hands had built and deciding that the inheritance was worth keeping. We do not know their names. But someone, at some point in the long history of this place, cut a small hole in a wall so that a voice could pass through the stone from one room to another. That is enough to know something true about them. Chapter 9. What was lost when they left? There is a particular kind of ending that leaves no ceremony behind. Not the ending marked by a final battle, or a signed agreement, or a date that someone thought to write down. The ending that happens slowly, without anyone deciding that it is happening. Without anyone present to mark the moment when something that had protected people for centuries simply ceased to be needed in the way it once was. That appears to be how Derinkuyu ended. Not with a dramatic final use. Not with a recorded last day underground. With a gradual withdrawing, a slow recession of the human presence that had shaped this space across many centuries. Until the deep levels were empty, and the upper levels had become storage rooms, and the full scale of what existed below had begun. Quietly and without announcement. To slip away. The later medieval period in Anatolia was one of sustained disruption. The Seljuk Turks transformed the political and demographic character of Cappadocia in the 11th century. The Mongol campaigns of the 13th century shattered whatever stability had been rebuilt. The campaigns of a conqueror known in the West as Tamerlane, around the turn of the 15th century, brought further destruction to communities still recovering from what had come before. Researchers propose that the active use of Derinkuyu as a functioning underground refuge likely declined and eventually ended somewhere in the later medieval period, though the precise timing is not documented with certainty and cannot be stated as settled fact. What can be said is that by the time the region had stabilized under Ottoman rule, the deep levels of the underground complex were no longer in active use as places of habitation. What is more certain is what was not lost. The upper levels continued to be used. The people of Derinkuyu in the centuries before 1963 were not entirely disconnected from the underground spaces below their town. They used the accessible chambers for the purposes that cool underground rock has always served in a hot climate. Food storage, wine storage, shelter for animals during summer heat. A thin thread of practical engagement with the underground world remained even as the deeper levels and the full story of what they represented faded from any living understanding. This is the part of the story that is easy to pass over quickly, and should not be. For several hundred years at minimum, possibly longer, the people living above Derinkuyu did not know what was below them. Not fully. Not in the way that would have allowed them to explain to a visitor what the complex was, how it had functioned, who had built it, or why. The engineering that had sustained thousands of people across multiple centuries of crisis, the church carved into the rock with its nave and apse, the wells arranged to reduce the risk of contamination from above, the rolling stone doors that only opened from inside, the ventilation system moving breathable air through levels of carved rock far below the surface. All of it was there, intact, preserved in the volcanic tuff that hardens over time rather than crumbling. The knowledge of what it meant did not survive. Think about what that means in practical terms. The people of Derinkuyu in the 17th or 18th century were not descendants of a different civilization. They were people living in the same landscape, above the same rock, breathing the same dry central Anatolian air that the Byzantine communities had breathed above those same stones centuries earlier. The continuity of human habitation in the region was never broken. There was no catastrophic depopulation that carried away the last people who might have remembered. The knowledge simply was not passed forward. Whether because the conditions that made the underground city necessary had changed enough that maintaining the full knowledge of how to use it no longer seemed urgent, whether because the specific traditions of transmission that had carried that knowledge through earlier generations were disrupted by the repeated waves of political and demographic change that swept through the region, whether because the knowledge was always partly carried in practice rather than formal instruction, and therefore more fragile than it appeared. For whatever combination of reasons, the thread broke, and a city that had sheltered approximately 20,000 people became, in the living memory of the community above it, a basement. There is a parallel here worth sitting with. The specialized knowledge that sustains complex systems is more fragile than the systems themselves. The volcanic tuff of Derinkuyu did not degrade. The carved passages did not collapse. The rolling stone doors did not corrode. The physical infrastructure of the underground city was more durable than almost anything built above ground in the same period. What did not survive was the understanding of what the infrastructure was for. And that understanding was lost not through catastrophe, but through the quiet, undramatic failure of transmission. One generation did not teach the next. The next generation did not ask. And the generation after that had nothing to ask about, because they did not know there was a question. The man who knocked down his basement wall in 1963 was not incurious or inattentive. He was a person whose world did not contain the information that would have told him to be curious about what was behind that wall. Centuries of forgetting had made that information unavailable to him. What researchers recovered after 1963 was the physical record of what had been built. The stones, the passages, the carved features, the layers of construction pointing toward different phases of use. What they could not recover was the experience of it. The sound of a community settling in for another night underground. The quality of light from oil lamps reflecting off curved volcanic tuff walls. The voices of children asking questions that their parents answered as honestly as they could. The prayers spoken in the carved church on a level far below the surface. The words rising through the rock toward a sky the congregation could not see. Those things are gone. Not because the stone failed to hold them, because the people who carried them in living memory eventually ran out of people to pass them to. That is the nature of what is lost when a place like Derinkuyu goes silent. Not the architecture, not the engineering, the human interior of it, the texture of what it felt like to be alive inside it, the specific weight of the courage it took to close that door and trust the stone and wait. That weight belongs to people whose names we do not know. And the silence they left behind is not empty. It is full of everything they knew and did not write down. Chapter 10. What Derinkuyu says about us. There is a temptation, at the end of a story like this one, to treat Derinkuyu as a relic, something from a distant and different world, something built by people whose circumstances were so removed from our own that whatever lessons it carries belong to the past rather than the present. Something we can admire from a careful distance without feeling its weight too directly. That temptation is worth resisting. Because the qualities that produce Derinkuyu are not qualities that belong to a particular century or a particular civilization. They are qualities that belong to human beings under specific kinds of pressure. And the pressure that produced them, the pressure of living in a world where the surface cannot always be trusted, where the structures that organize safety can fail faster than any single generation anticipates, is not a pressure that history has retired. Begin with what the building of Derinkuyu actually required. It required patience of a kind that is genuinely difficult for any individual person to sustain. Because the timescale of the project exceeded any individual life, the underground city as it exists today was not built in a decade or a generation. It was built across centuries. The people who dug the deepest levels did not live to see the rolling stone doors installed above them. The people who carved the church did not know the people who first cut the ventilation shafts. The community that sealed itself inside during a 7th century raid was using infrastructure that had been built by people who had been dead for centuries. Every generation that contributed to Derinkuyu was doing something that required a particular act of imagination. They were building for people they would never meet, solving problems for communities that did not yet exist, investing labor and skill and time into something whose full value would only be realized by their descendants. In circumstances their descendants would face alone. That is not a small thing. It is one of the rarest and most admirable qualities that human communities have ever demonstrated. The willingness to build beyond the horizon of a single life. To do the hard work of preparation not because you will benefit from it but because the people who come after you will need it. Modern societies have their own versions of this challenge. The infrastructure that sustains contemporary life was largely built by generations that are now gone. Each generation that inherits that infrastructure makes choices about whether to maintain it, improve it, extend it. Each generation decides, in effect, whether to be the kind of community that builds for the future or the kind that consumes what the past built without replenishing it. The people of Derinkuyu, across many centuries and many distinct communities, chose to build forward. Not because they were more virtuous than other people, because they understood, from lived experience, that the world above was not reliably safe, and that the only adequate response to that knowledge was preparation that extended beyond what any single crisis required. There is another quality that Derinkuyu demonstrates, one that is less obvious but equally important. The underground city was not built by a single centralized authority imposing its will on a subject population. There is no evidence of a king of Derinkuyu, no royal inscription, no monument to the ruler whose vision produced the complex. What the archaeological record suggests instead is something more distributed and more durable. A community practice, maintained across generations, adapted by each generation to its own circumstances, but continuous enough to produce something that no single generation could have built alone. The rolling stone doors were not approved by a bureaucracy. They were designed by people who had thought carefully about a specific problem and solved it with the materials and tools they had. The ventilation system was not the product of a centralized engineering department. It was the accumulated result of generations of people understanding what the space needed and providing it. This distributed intelligence produced something that the great centralized building projects of the ancient world did not produce in the same way. Something that could be maintained and extended by ordinary people without extraordinary resources, because it had been built by ordinary people without extraordinary resources in the first place. The political powers above Derinkuyu changed repeatedly across the centuries of its use. The Hittites, the Phrygians, the Persians, the Romans, the Byzantines, the Seljuks, the Mongols, the Ottomans. Each of these powers controlled the surface of Cappadocia at different points. Each of them represented, during its period of dominance, what most people living through that period would have understood as the permanent structure of the world. The political powers above changed repeatedly. The underground city remained. That is not a philosophical claim. It is simply what the record shows. Now consider what the builders of Derinkuyu understood about their own situation. They understood that the world above was uncertain. That certainty could not be borrowed from whoever happened to be in power at any given moment. That the only reliable form of safety was the kind you built yourself, into materials that did not depend on political arrangements to remain standing. That understanding, arrived at through lived experience across many centuries in a geographically vulnerable place, produced the rolling stone doors, the sealed wells, the ventilation shafts, the church carved into the middle of the earth. It was the understanding of people who had looked at their situation clearly and responded to what they actually saw rather than what they wished were true. That is what Derinkuyu says about us. Not that we should be afraid. Not that collapse is inevitable or that the surface cannot be trusted in any immediate practical sense. It says that the communities most likely to endure are the ones that build honestly for the future they actually inhabit, rather than the one they prefer to imagine. The underground city is still there. The rock holds. Come back to 1963. Come back to the moment before the wall came down. A man stands in his basement with whatever tool he was using. He is thinking about storage space, or a larger room, or simply about the wall in front of him and the work required to move it. He is not thinking about the 7th century or the 13th. He is not thinking about Arab raids or Mongol campaigns or the long, slow collapse of the Bronze Age world. He is thinking about his wall. The wall comes down. Behind it is a tunnel. And behind the tunnel, stretching down through what researchers describe as up to 18 levels of carved volcanic rock. Waiting in the dark, with the patience of stone, is everything we have spent this night exploring together. The ventilation system moving air through the rock by nothing more than geometry and gravity. The wells arranged to keep the water supply in the hands of the people inside. The rolling doors that only open from inside. The church carved into the middle of the earth. Its apse facing east. Its nave sized for a congregation that would gather below the surface and pray toward a sky they could not see. The small holes in the walls where voices passed through the stone from one room to another, keeping families connected in the dark. A space large enough for 20,000 lives, built not in one generation, but across many. By people whose names are gone, and whose work remains, and above all of it, for several hundred years at minimum. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, storing their wine in the upper chambers, keeping their animals cool in the summer heat, going about the daily work of being alive in a landscape they shared with something immense that they could feel beneath their feet but could no longer fully name. Until one morning, a wall came down, and the stone, patient as it has always been, offered everything it had been holding. That is where this story ends. Not in the ancient world. Not in the crisis that sealed the doors for the last time. In a basement, in 1963, in the ordinary human curiosity that knocked on the rock and found the rock had something to say. The deep levels of Derinkuyu are still there tonight. The ventilation shafts are still open to the sky above the town. Somewhere below the streets of Derinkuyu. The air is moving through the carved rock, exactly as it was designed to do. By people whose names are gone and whose understanding of what survival required was carved so deeply into the stone that it outlasted everything. Let your breathing slow. The stone holds. It has always held. Sleep well, and dream of what endures. Good night.